All right, without further ado, let's talk about some Neal Brown. Yeah, Neal Brown is someone who I've been looking into, kind of been a curiosity for almost 2 years now. Well, I knew about him earlier. Many of you, I don't know if you know him, you might know him as, for a variety of different reasons. He was well known as a businessman. He is largely considered, probably the thing you would know him from is the lawyer for the Wausau Group, the group of businessmen who, mostly lumber barons, people who had their money in the old 1800s businesses, the lumber mills and things like that. And then they reinvested that wealth into the paper companies, the insurance, the utilities, the things that then gave the Wausau area its purpose into the new century. And yeah, it's true. He was the lawyer for that. And we'll talk more about all of these things in a second. But as you saw from the first image, big outdoorsman Neal Brown was. At a time before outdoorsman wasn't really a thing. He was an enthusiastic fisherman, hunter, outdoor. He kept bees. He was very fond of telling people that he grew up on a farm, so he could do any job on the farm, even well into his advanced age. You could drop him down on any farm, and he'd be able to do it. The outdoors was a big importance to him. There's also this idea of philosophy, which is kind of a vague term, but I think applies. And it's, there's a reason they call him the Sage of Wausau. He definitely was very well known for his way of seeing things, and was seen as sort of a wise man in that regard. He is a political person, absolutely. Neal Brown is one of especially for the Wausau Group and that kind of group of people, he is absolutely the most politically active and outspoken person at this time among his peers, right? But he was primarily known for, the thing that he did for a living was practice law. And actually, it's a good place to start. So, as I said, Neal grew up on a farm. He was born in Jefferson County near Fort Atkinson. And he spent the first 19 years working on the farm. And then he decided to pursue a law career. And he worked for a little while for this guy, Caswell. So Lucien Caswell was a former representative from Wisconsin in Congress. At this point, he had a law practice in Fort Atkinson. And so Neal was working for him for about 2 years. And then he went off to Madison and attended classes at the university law department. He enjoyed it. It's one of the few parts of the university that he felt was doing good things. And he had some thoughts about university that I won't get into, but I think for him it was also Madison was too big of a city, which is weird to say, but it was. And so he decided in 1880, after graduating with his degree and becoming a member of the Wisconsin board or bar, he goes to Wausau, Wisconsin. In 1880, I don't know if this is 1880, but this is kind of what it was like back then. We are very much focused on lumber and not a lot else. There is some farming that's starting to happen, for sure, but for the most part, it's still a lumbering community. We only had the railroad for like 5 years. Still very, very early. But that's what Neal decided, this is where I'm going to spend my life. So he practices law for about 2 years by himself. He kind of struggles. He doesn't quite have the reputation yet, but he's making some inroads. For about a year or two, he has a practice with another lawyer in town named B.J. Pink, just kind of getting started there. But in 1885, he ends up going into business with another young lawyer. These are not from the same era. This is just the pictures, obviously, but Louis Pratt. Pratt had been raised in western Marathon County. He had actually spent a little while teaching out there, but had come to Wausau to pursue the law. And the two of them hit it off immediately. They worked together very well professionally. And personally, they became fast friends. And so they decided to go off into their own career in having their own practice. So from 1885 on, until Neal's death, actually in 1917, the two of them will have a law practice together. In the late 1890s, though, Pratt will actually be appointed the Assistant Attorney General to the United States. And so he's going to be off doing it in Washington. And they did have some other people that worked with them, other lawyers, as you do. Around 1900, Neal, there's a young guy who started working with them when he was about 14, 15 years old. His name is Fred Genrich. And Fred is going to be brought on in a full capacity in 1900 after he, qualifies or he is admitted to the bar. That's the terminology. So for most of the 20th century, the next 17 years, this is the practice. There's a couple years in there where they also bring on this Scandinavian guy, Orlof Anderson, but by 1910 he goes off and has his own practice. So for the most part, this is the law firm that Neal operates out of. And note, practice in all courts. It's interesting. This is not like Neal coming to Wausau in the 1880s and 90s. Like, this is not a place that you would go to specialize. You have to be able to do all sorts of law, including some murder trial. This is him here at the Wisconsin Supreme Court in the second hearing for the Emery and Lord case, which is a murder case that happened, I think, in Wood County originally. It's kind of coming out of that. So he was on the defense for this. He loses this case, but as everybody said, Neal Brown never lost a trial unless his client was guilty, which I guess you say about everybody, but this is absolutely true here. And certainly, even though he lost the case, these sort of experiences of getting out, Neal was great at this. He made an impression. He was very, very smart, for sure. He was somebody who, he had a grasp of the law and how things worked. And he was also very good at speaking. If you put him in front of a jury, he's going to make an impression. And this is something that is going to continue throughout the rest of his career. Now, Brown and Pratt actually, I'm not sure if it's in conjunction with or separate from, they also in 1885 get involved in a new company called the Wausau Land and Law Land Association. Originally, it was in conjunction with a couple other people. There are 4 other partners, the Pullings. They're not going to be involved for very much longer. By like not too long into the 1890s, like 6-7 years later, they're going to be gone, and instead they're going to bring in Charles Gilbert. And the 3 of them, Brown, Pratt, and Gilbert, are going to be the guys in charge of this. What is this? It's a good question. Well, these are from the 1880s. They're buying up a lot of the pine land, and then they're selling it. They're basically buying and selling land. So it's kind of a speculation thing, but it's also a legal sort of operation, right? If you need somebody to, for example, get some abstracts, they were the ones they would give you the abstract for your property. Or if there was like litigation. So for example, I think it's through this. We go out to Unity. In 1904, Neal Brown gets involved in litigating something that's been in the courts for about 10 years. Back in the 1890s, this little community on the western part of Marathon County decided, hey, we should be a village. So they had a vote, and they incorporated. But not everybody agreed. And so it kind of gets held up in the courts, and it takes about 10 years to officially become a village. And so, yeah, in 1904, Neal Brown is part of the team that kind of clears that up and makes it possible for it to become a village proper. As another example, Neal Brown is closer to home. Neal Brown is very involved in the annexing, or the expansion of the city of Wausau. So this is a map of the city of Wausau. It's turned on its side, so on the right is north. Get the orientation there. This is a sandboard map, and one of the cool things is they have the legal additions. So you can see these lines, or this text kind of in there. I know you can't read it, but I'll just point this out. These all have Brown's name in it. So the expansion, as in like turn of the century, we start to expand eastward. The building of the high school, for example, the high school is right here. And around that is Dunbar and Brown's Park Addition and Dunbar and Brown's addition to the Park Addition. So you can see there's that also up on the northeast side, especially. Maple Hill up there, and then this map doesn't go high enough, but Forest Park would also be something that he was very involved in developing. While we're talking about involvement locally, this isn't just land and neighborhoods popping up, it's also the stuff that's happening in Wausau. So, for example, up in that Maple Hill addition, we have the building of St. Mary's Hospital. And Neal was very involved in getting the land so that they could build this hospital. And in fact, in 1907, when they laid the cornerstone, Neal Brown gave the address as part of that. Neal was also involved in some other things. So for example, the original library that was built, this is actually made possible by a Carnegie grant from the Carnegie Foundation. or Carnegie. Never really sure. Carnegie, I think. Anyway, I don't think you need to guess who was responsible for getting that. Neal Brown. He was the one that actually put the petition in to get the money to be able to build this. He was involved in the creation of the Wausau Club in 1901. He was part of the people involved in that. Before that, he was one of the founding members of the Wausau Country Club to play golf. Trying to think of what else. The Grand Opera House was built. He was on the committee when that got built in 1899 into 1900. That's basically where the Grand Theater is today. It's the precursor to that. He was very involved in the Cemetery Association, and basically if something happened, this is just a cross-section from like 1900 to 1910, anything that happened in Wausau, Neal Brown was probably involved to some extent or another. It's pretty remarkable. So, little diversion here about the law. He's also making friends here. Yeah, question?
You mentioned about the cemetery. There was an original cemetery that got flooded out.
Yep, that's way before this point. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Yeah, so it is Pine Grove, yep. So this is a picture that I found literally like a day and a half ago, which is surprising. I don't know, it's in Malcolm Rochelt's book, a picture history of Marathon County. And I thought, oh, he didn't even include Neal Brown because he's not with the other Wausau Group guys, but actually it turns out he is. So this is Neal right here. Rochelt's caption here seems to indicate that this is some sort of like theatrical or like sort of small thing that they put on. Maybe it's just a group of friends. Either way, this is a interesting group of people. And I won't get too sidetracked in getting through everybody, but there's a couple people that are worth pointing out besides Neal. So you have Neal. That's Louis Pratt. Louis's wife is actually the row in front of her kind of leaning towards him. Dorothy, I think. But the one that I want to talk about here, just as a means of transition, is actually this person here, which is Helen Van Vechten. Or, I don't know, depending on when this was taken, maybe Helen Bruno. She is going to be fairly famous because it turns out, and she wasn't initially trying to do this, but it turns out she's really good at printing. She and her husband Philip get involved in a little startup company, little press called the Philosopher Press. So that's Neal, by the way, and that's Helen. William Ellis, who's the guy seated in like the back, the far right side, he came to town in the 1890s, and he ends up starting this little press, which is really remarkable. And not to get too sidetracked, because I could go off for another half an hour just about this press. It's fascinating, but it's part of this larger movement that is part of this anti-intellectual kind of thing, in the sense that at the time, in the 1800s, if you wanted to write a piece of poetry, for example, and you wanted to get it published, well, there were maybe half a dozen places in the country that you could have gotten that published, and the editors that were responsible for what gets published had a very specific idea, and so they were kind of, of what should be published. What is poetry? And if you didn't conform to that, well, we're not going to give you any publication. And so there was this attempt to say, well, hey, let's do it ourselves. And so there's these little chapbooks, little publishing firms. There's also an element here of the arts and crafts movement, which is the idea that like the Industrial Revolution is making it possible for us to print lots and lots of books. And there's a lot of people that are more literate than ever before, so they can read. But the books that are being published are not great in the eyes of these people, both in terms of the physical books, like the paper's thin, the ink smudges, it's just kind of designed to just get it out there. It's not really thought through. Also, the contents don't seem to be that great. It's for the mass public, so we're not doing anything creative or interesting. It's just to sell the copies. And so one of the things they do is they say, well, we're going to make our handmade books. And the Philosopher Press doesn't go quite this far as some of their contemporaries, but some of them were like, okay, we need to study a medieval Venetian type, like from the medieval era, and we're going to take that typesetting and we're going to make our own version of it, and we're going to use it for one book. Like that level. We're going to hand make our paper, we're going to hand make the ink, we're going to go every step of the way, and then we're going to make a handful of copies. They don't go that far. The Americans kind of do commercialize it, but that's kind of the idea. It's kind of an attempt to say, all right, we're going to do it ourselves, And also, we're going to kind of reflect, we're going to do something separate from what the larger expectations are, which is one of the reasons that they're in a log cabin. They build the Philosopher Press in a log cabin because they want to embody this idea that they're not part of the big city experience. They're here up in the Northwoods. They're here closer to nature. Helen is the one that actually makes the books and makes them really well, it turns out. But Neal is also going to be involved in the development of the philosophy side of things. No pun intended, I guess. Also, just note the woman standing next to Neal there is Louise Norton Brown, his wife. He gets married in 1892. I'm probably not going to go too deep into her. We'll talk about her a little bit later on, but another fascinating side story that we'll maybe touch on later. So, as part of the Philosopher Press, not only do they make books, but they also put up like a newsletter. It's called a chapbook style. Chapbook is kind of a specific, like the thing that everybody's emulating. Anyway, you can kind of see the element here. This is not just thrown together. This is conscious. The colors, the graphic design is very evident here. This is the very first edition that comes out in 1898, the first issue, and Neal contributes a little couple pages here about advice to a philosopher. And what he's saying here, I'm not gonna, you don't have to read the whole thing, but, or any of it really. Basically what he's saying is, we're not intellectuals, we're philosophers. We have wisdom, we have insight, but it's not coming from our position as, having gone through the university system. It's more personal, right? And his advice here is essentially, if you want to be a philosopher, if you're one of these people who want to contribute as part of this movement, when you make something, don't do it for the audience. Don't do it so that it'll sell copies. Don't do it so the critics will like what you do. Do it as you want to do it. And if it's good, then people will like it. And if not, well, at least you will have tried to be authentic to yourself and do something that means something. So there's some philosophy here, right? Just to give you a contrast, he also does some other things. His second thing that he publishes is an article called The Weather, Its Use and Abuse, in which he basically says, yeah, people use weather as small talk. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Don't demean it. It has its uses. But if you are an author and you're writing a novel and you say it's a dark and stormy night, you can go on. We get it. You don't need to then describe in detail all of the wind coming through and the crack of the lightning. And it's like, just get to the meat of the story. You're distracting everything. So you can see there's a bunch of different aspects of his philosophy coming through here. Neal Brown writes a lot. And I won't get too sidetracked on this. This is kind of the thing that I spent most of last year reading through everything that he wrote. And he writes a lot. There was I think 30, 40 different bits of things that he contributed to the Philosopher, for example, things that he wrote as a political tract, things that were, here's the kind of stuff: philosophy, literary criticism, a lot of the stuff that he ends up doing for the Philosopher, and it gets republished in a special book in 1899 called Critical Confessions. He's like, well, let me tell you about this author, Andrew Lang. Here's what I think about him. Here's Henri de Balzac. Here's what I think about him, and these sort of things. So there's some literary criticism. He's part of that movement. Instructional. Like I said, Neal Brown is a great outdoors person, so he delights in telling people, hey, what kind of rod should you use while fly fishing? Which is also there's a need for that, because there's not a lot of other opportunities for people to learn that sort of skill. So he likes doing that. Political, of course, as I said, he is a political guy. In 1908, he is particularly prestigious in this, in producing a lot of political stuff, and he ends up republishing it into a little booklet called Some Questions of the Hour. Let's talk about his politics. So, in 1890, he runs for the state legislature in the assembly, and he is elected to represent us. So he spends a 2-year term there, and then he follows that up by getting elected to the state senate. So then he has a 6-year term. So from 1891 to 1898, he is representing us in the government. He is a Democrat, which is unfortunate for him at this point in time, because the Democrats are not doing well against the Republicans. This is an era in which the Republicans kind of dominate. And I guess I should put the quick caveat. The Democrats and Republicans are very different parties as they are now. Both of them had pretty wide tense, that maybe now are a little bit more polarized. But anyway, the point is, Neal was actually one of those people who's kind of centrist. He was less about like big concepts and more about like, hey, let's get stuff done. And so he was someone that the Republicans actually respected a lot because he would work with them and do all of that stuff. So in 1893, there was I should step back and say, in the US Senate in Washington, at this point in time, we don't have the direct election of senators, which means that we didn't go to the polls and say who we want to represent us in the Senate, and instead, we would elect our legislation, and then the folks down in Madison would decide who goes and represents Wisconsin. So he actually was put up in 1893 as the Democratic candidate for that, I think because he was somebody that maybe they thought maybe they could pull a couple votes from the Republicans, but unfortunately, the Democrats are in the minority at this point, and he does not go on. But he does spend some time here. Let's talk a little bit about his politics specifically. So he is actually brought up in a very political household. This is his father. His name is Thurlow Weed Brown. It's a weird name. It's one of those New England families. They just have interesting names. He comes from New York, where he had a little. He was a newspaper editor. He had well, actually, here, what is it called? The Cayuga Chief. He moves it to Wisconsin. He comes here for his health. They decide, actually, we want to stay here, so he moves to Fort Atkinson. And eventually, he renames the newspaper the Wisconsin Chief, largely to coincide with the addition of anti-slavery sentiment. This is the creation of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. Let's get rid of slavery. He's a big proponent. But he's probably best known for being a temperance person. He's somebody who feels that we should all temper our indulgence of alcohol and the society would be better. And he's also starting to get kind of that militancy of, hey, maybe we should prohibit people from drinking alcohol. And this is from the Wisconsin Historical Society website. It's just a quick, blurb. But I'll note that and this is true, he's probably the man most responsible for bringing the temperance movement back into the forefront. It was not Wisconsin, we're not that fond of not drinking, but he really makes it, in his writing, and he would go around and speak, so, he's very much involved. Now, unfortunately, he does die fairly young. He was in his 40s, leaving, Neal without a father. But he still, grew up in a very political household, even without that. His aunt was Emma Brown. She co-ran the newspaper with Thurlow Weed. And she actually turns it into, and it becomes sort of the de facto suffragist paper in Wisconsin. So she's arguing for women to get the vote. Now, to what extent Neal followed in the footsteps of his father and aunt is unclear. I know that he was very much in favor of women's suffrage. But again, he's in Wisconsin. He's in central Wisconsin, where we are very German-dominated, and for a variety of complicated reasons, the Germans complicated reasons that they don't like suffrage. Not so complicated why they don't like prohibition. That's pretty evident. So in both instances, if he did feel that they were important and he supported them, he didn't make a big deal about it. He's not in the and understand, Neal Brown is not shy about letting his political beliefs be known. He would write letters to the editor. He would get out there if he thought it was important. He doesn't really make a big deal about these. He's not really a big social cause guy. But he is very moved by tax reform, or tariff reform. So he grew up as a Republican, and when he moves to Wausau, he's a Republican. But in 1888, he gets fired up about the issue of tariff reform. And don't worry, I'm not going to go into the details of this. It's pretty dry. But basically, tariffs are when you export and import goods, it's that fee duties that the United States will put on something coming into the country, and then often will be put when you export as well. And this is the sort of technical information, the workings of the government that Neal, the mechanical prospect of how do we make this work for what we need it to do. That's what Neal gets really fired up about, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, this is the issue. He becomes a Democrat in 1888, and he will continue to be a Democrat for the rest of his life. Now, even after getting out of the legislature, he is still very much in the political world. This is an article from 1902 where basically in 1902, and basically every 2 years from this point forward, Neal Brown will come up as a potential candidate for the governor. This is the closest he got. He was basically he threw his hat in the ring to become the Democratic nominee for the race. He doesn't get it, but he continues to kind of be involved. So 1904, 1906, I believe as well. 1908, he really gets involved, and this time he sees an opportunity because there's a presidential election. Roosevelt, who's very popular, is not running. Taft is running. So this is an opportunity. So he gets fired up. William Jennings Bryan, he doesn't really like William Jennings Bryan, but you know what? He is a charismatic figure that the Democrats can rally around. So he's very excited. That's when he wrote all of that stuff that gets republished in the thing I showed you before. And he fails. By this point, we do have direct election of senators, I should clarify. So the public decides, he gets the vote here in central Wisconsin, but the rest of the state, they're not so excited about him as a candidate. As I said, continues to be kind of talked about as a governor candidate. I just thought this was interesting. Apparently in 1910, he was one of the candidates suggested to be a Supreme Court judge. And President Taft actually appointed 6 different Supreme Court judges in 1910 alone, which I didn't know about. But he doesn't make the cut, so obviously that's an alternate reality that we don't live in. So, you know, we started with this idea I used for the program the Seven Sage, or the Sage of Wausau. That's something that by 1902 he starts to use as sort of his brand, and it's apt, right? The Seven Sages. This is a later, medieval illuminated graphic here, but originally the concept of the Seven Sages was put forth by Plato, the Greek philosopher and thinker, in one of his dialogues. And basically these 7 men in Greece during the 6th and 7th centuries BC that were like just stand out in their ability to, were wise for their philosophy, for their statesmen, for their lawgivers. And you can kind of see how this sort of classical understanding of a sage, it applies to Neal, right? He's a philosopher. He is in the state, he's statecraft. He is a politician, and he does get involved in the law. I think he also liked this illusion because of there he is. I think he also liked this because sage has a botanical application, right? Neal Brown loved the outdoors. He was a big fan of plants. In 1900, the Wisconsin Horticultural Society actually had a meeting here in Wausau, and they got Neal Brown to give the opening address. And he gets very, welcoming them, and he takes them to task for not doing a good job of explaining how you should transplant trees. People don't know how to do that, and they kill the tree. Again, the sort of thing that he gets fired up about. I think actually the white pine would have been his favorite plant. He talks very passionately about it, and it makes sense because the white pine is what builds this area. It's the lumbering. And actually, you see it appear over and over. I don't think it's a coincidence that Neal Brown was involved in The Philosopher, and they use for their symbol a green pine tree. Their tagline on the stuff that they printed was printed at the sign of the green pine tree. So you can see that influence kind of coming in. And, we mentioned Pine Grove. It was not full of trees in the 1800s. When they moved it and they started to actually make that the cemetery off Grand Avenue, Neal takes it upon himself to oversee the planting of hundreds of pine trees. And in fact, it doesn't become Pine Grove until 1904. That's when, because of all the pine trees and the work that Neal had done, let's call it Pine Grove. I think up to that point, it was mostly just known as the Wausau Cemetery, So Pine Grove. So I should talk about his home. So as I said, he gets married in 1892. It's an interesting marriage. They get along, I think. They have a lot of shared interests, as you would hope in this. But it's also kind of, it almost feels like a marriage of convenience. Neal is, in 1892, his political career is on the rise. He's this young, single man. Maybe there's some question about, whatever. And apparently after a session of the legislature, instead of getting on a train and going north like he had planned on, he surprised everybody by going south to Chicago. And there's a little, neighborhood out there called Lockport, sort of community out there, and that's where Louise lived. They had met previously. There was a connection between the family, and her father was actually one of the leading merchants, had a very thriving company at that point. So before anybody knew what happened, that not only had he eloped with her, but they were in their honeymoon in Niagara Falls. So it's like, oh, okay. So they moved back to Wausau, yeah, she, as you saw, also involved in that circle of philosophers. She contributed a couple things, drawings, and she was very artistically gifted. By 1905, they're not together. And it's a little unclear. The papers don't talk about anything happening, but maybe Neal Brown was the sort of person you don't, air any laundry. I don't know if it was amicable. Maybe they thought, okay, this isn't great. But she goes off to go to law school not law school, art school in New York, and then she just kind of never returns. Neal Brown will list his marital status as divorced, but I don't think we can't really find any firm divorce papers filed. She will list her marital status as widowed. And in fact, she is buried under the name Louise Norton Brown. So it's a little unclear. I think, as I said, maybe it's a marriage of convenience. I think she certainly wasn't the sort of person that wanted to just be, what women were expected to do at that point in time, to be housekeepers and to, raise children. She got to live her best life traveling. After her death, there was a book published posthumously of Japanese woodcut art that she had collected. So she travels the world and does that. And Neal, continues to live his life. This is the house they built together on Franklin Street. It's still there, still lovely. It's changed a little bit over the years. The turret is no longer there. This is what it would look like in 1984 as part of the intensive survey that was put together. By this point, the house aside, the yard is the real attraction, I think, for Neal Brown. He entertains, his property is like half the block. And he goes out of his way to, he and Louise apparently made an attempt to try and transplant a tree from every native tree to Wisconsin in their property. So they were big on that, and that becomes, a central point for him. In fact, this is where his funeral was held. In 1917, Neal Brown finally, I guess I should clarify, Neal Brown dies. That shouldn't be too big of a spoiler. He died a long time ago. In 1912, he starts to slow down. Something, his friends and contemporaries kind of notice he's starting to slow down. Over the next few years, it's just something's not right. When he dies in 1917, he is in New York at a sanitarium seeking some help. He's there with C.S. Gilbert, his friend and law partner, and his sister Mabel Green, who actually is the last surviving direct relative of Neal, and she and her family live out in Oregon. But yeah, he does die. It's a little unclear exactly of what. Some of the papers would say that he had heart condition failure. It seems likely it was some sort of Bright's disease is also brought up. So it's some sort of organ failure. And ultimately, he does pass. He's brought back to Wausau, and so many people want to attend the funeral that they have it outdoors in his backyard, which is also a fitting place given the care and effort that he put in. Yeah. I think I'm blanking. 63. He was in his mid. He was not an old man at that point. It was. I wouldn't say that it was tragically young, but he still had a lot of years that he definitely would have had, and he was in some ways, as we'll see, kind of still in his prime. Maybe not prime, but anyway, funeral. So it's overseen by the talk. The proceedings is given by Reverend Evans from the Methodist Church. And it's, of course, it being Neal Brown, the Wausau Pilot gives basically the first page of the edition. I think it's the first page, basically over to coverage of his life and his, so they include the speech. I'm just going to read part of it here. To those have been his guests that have ridden with him, fished and hunted with him, sat and talked with him in the intimacy of his lodge on the Plover or in his home, what a man he was. Originality, homely philosophy, genial humor, sterling common sense, love of books, of nature, and of men. This combination expressing itself through his person made his companionship wonderfully stimulating to the mind and soul. And what strength there was. Rugged is the word that qualifies the face, the form, the mind, the character, the direct antithesis of the adjective effeminate. No man was more conscious of his faults than he was, but his were the faults of a strong man. And it continues on. I do want to point out, there seems to be this emphasis on masculinity, that he embodied the being a man. And I don't know, again, we don't really know the personal life if, the marriage was whatever it was, but I think that there's also a very clear element of, what was happening at the time was, the concept of masculinity was very closely attached to the outdoors, right? This is where I, in an earlier draft, had a long tangent where I talked about the frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner and all of these. We won't go off on that. But basically, the idea that was, I think there was sort of the industrialization of the 1800s created a lot of disruption to the way that people lived their lives. Especially given the way things were before. Now we're living in cities. We're having to wake up and clock in and clock out, and basically work to pay rent for, all of this stuff is disconcerting to a lot of people. And it creates this sense of anxiety about, what does this mean for society? And one of the things that like Turner says that, well, Americans are based off of the frontier. That's the character, but there's no frontier by the turn of the century, right? And there's an extent to this, like the cowboy and the lumberjack, these are very American sort of concepts. You can't really push the frontier when there's no more land to push the frontier. And so what ends up happening is people say, well, the way that you deal with this anxiety is you go back to the way things used to be. You go out and live, to an extent you could say, well, go to a park and take a walk and hear some birds, and that can have a very helpful attitude. But there is also this element of you want to get over your insecurities or whatever, go out and go hunting, go fishing, go cattle ranching, things like that. And Neal Brown embodies that in a big way. So towards the end, he says, his ruggedness of body made him revel in life. His familiarity and love of nature in all her phases and moods, combined with this virality, made him love the out of doors. He loved the out of doors as a boy loves the swimming hole. He plunged in it, soaked in it, drink in it at every pore. And yeah, he definitely embodied that. While he was doing all of the politics and the law, he was very quickly becoming the leading fisherman in Wisconsin, for sure. In about 1912, he becomes, I don't know if they knew each other before, but there was this newspaperman from the Chicago Tribune named Burt Lancaster Taylor, BLT. And he comes up to talk to Neal Brown. According to his column in the Tribune, he was coming to talk to try to get him to support Teddy Roosevelt, which, yeah, that wasn't going to happen. But it's also sort of a pretense. Oh darn, I have to go up to Neal Brown's fishing cabin and go fishing with him. What a chore. And they become friends, and he convinces him to actually contribute to the Tribune. I think there's about 10, 11 columns where he goes into detail. Like I said, he loves to share his experience. Here's what you need to know about trout fishing. Then again, you couldn't just go to the sporting goods store and say, all right, what do I need? No, you had to figure out what kind of rod you needed, or what else do you need to bring while you're going out into the wilderness. And again, Neal was great about that. As I mentioned, the Arcadia on Plover is what it's called. This is his hunting cabin, hunting and fishing. It became mostly a fishing cabin. It's out on the Plover River. It's basically, if you go outside of Wausau, Town Line Road, and just keep going to about where Hatley, sort of north-south of Hatley, that's where we think it is. It is no longer in existence. It burned down in the 40s, unfortunately, although it was something that after his death, his friends put a bunch of money together to try to keep it going. So they did continue to use it. And actually, Neal is in this picture. For the longest time, I didn't realize it, but he is right there. I don't know if you can see that, but he's just sitting in the shadow. And the caption does not indicate that it's Neal Brown, but it is. So he would during the midst of all this stuff, this is how he would just take off in his automobile. He's one of the first automobile owners in the town. Apparently, he was a menace on the streets. And he would go out here. And then this became like a place where he would entertain. He had a second location. In addition to his lovely home in Wausau, he would have the Rotary Club. Here you go. There's Neal. The Rotary Club, let's have him, an event out here, make some barbecue for them. Or the Campfire Club of Chicago would come up and he would entertain them out there. And this became sort of a place that he could, a kind of an extension of that sort of philosopher, kind of let's get people together and have discussions. Which is, I think, where the name Arcadia and Plover, kind of going back to that ancient Greek sort of experience. Similarly, he was one of the founding members of the Deerfoot Lodge, which is a hunting lodge up on Lake Laura. He had been going up with some friends here in Wausau to Lake Catherine early in the century, but about 1910 they decided, there's an opportunity to buy up this lodge near Lake Laura nearby, and we'll turn it into a hunting lodge. And so they did that, and it allowed for a lot more people to go. So they started to bring up friends. And again, Neal Brown is the guy you want to go hunting with, right? It's just like the fishing, he'll show you the ropes. That first year in 1910, he wrote I think like 7-page letter to everybody that was going, all right, you don't know what you're doing? Let me lay out what you need to know. Here's what you need to bring. Here's the stuff you should do for safety. We're going to be out tramping through the woods. Make sure that you get back by the end of the day. And if you get lost, don't just keep going, because it'll be months before you hit another human being, possibly. So like all of these things, but also like what kind of coat should you bring, and all of that stuff. Again, it's not just instructional. Neal is also like the life of the party in extent. Like he publishes a book of songs that he writes, and they're like hunting songs. They're kind of corny, but that's kind of the point, right? So yeah, he's the person that you want to go with. And again, in the same way that he would bring up friends to go fishing with him, he would also entertain people from all around. Hey, let's go out hunting with Neal Brown. And that was pretty cool. There he is. This is a group of Wausau folks going up to Deerfoot Lodge. And interestingly, this is one of 3 pictures that is sometimes used to describe the Wausau Group. Because there's a lot of Wausau Group people in here. Now, unfortunately, none of the actual pictures that we use to describe the Wausau Group actually include all of the people that were part of it. This is the one that we see most often, but this was taken in 1922, and this is not the Wausau Group. This is just a bunch of people that are on the board of the Marathon Paper Company visiting Menasha. But it does hit a lot of the people that would have been alive at that point, like D.C. Everest and Walter Alexander, and people like that. The problem with this one, and we don't have an alternative, so it is what it is. But the problem with this one is it doesn't include the 2 people that were probably most influential in creating the Wausau Group and making it successful. The first was Alexander Stewart, who died in 1912. 1913? 1912. And he was the guy who, sort of the leader of the group. I guess I shouldn't take for granted that you all know what the Wausau Group is. Kind of brief description here. Around 1900, knowing that they had all of their livelihoods in the lumber industry, but the lumber industry was not long for this world, because the Wisconsin, pinery had been cut down, and we still had a lot of potential here because of the water power of the Wisconsin River, but you had to get the stuff to cut. So one of the things they do is they buy up a bunch of southern, timberland. The southern United States opens up some reserves, and they're going to create these companies. Actually, a lot of them are, incorporated by Neal Brown, in Arkansas, in Missouri, in Mississippi, to kind of cut this. And it was unique because, like, the people were going, this is crazy. We're putting trees on train cars and bringing them up to Wisconsin? Okay. But that's what they had to do. And that was just a short-term plan. In the long term, they realized that what we have going for us here in Wausau is a concentration of wealth, and these guys knew what they were doing. And so they put their skills to work, investing in companies to make sure that Wausau had an industrial future here, that our industries would be diverse and that we could continue without lumber. There's a lot of companies. So let me just talk about some of the companies real quick here. These are the ones that are just in the Wausau area. There are a bunch like the Masonite Corporation, for example, which starts here but ends up going down to Mississippi. But the first one is supposedly Wausau Papers. This is up in Brokaw. Like a lot of the Wausau Group ventures, it's not anybody here that comes up with the idea. It's the guy, Brokaw, who says, hey, we should put a mill up there. But they go, yes, we're going to fund that. It turns out to be successful. And eventually the Wausau Group will kind of take over running it. That leads to the success, and so they go, all right, let's do this again. Marathon Paper, that's down in Rothschild. That gets opened a little bit later. The water power rights for that, by the way, were secured a few years earlier by one Neal Brown as in part of the group. You'll see this. I won't go through all of these, but Neal is involved in a lot of this. He also is getting the water power rights at another place on the Wisconsin River, which is where the Trap River enters in. So naturally, they go, hey, we should make another paper company, but the Trap River doesn't work out. So instead, they go to Mosinee. So Mosinee Paper, that's another paper mill. That's kind of the big three. Off of these, we get some other things. The electric streetcars finally get okayed by the city of Wausau, and so Neal and company go, great, let's get some trolleys. And so that's another thing. They've, within a year and a half, go, okay, this isn't profitable, but you know what would be profitable if we bought the electric company that was giving us the electricity? And so the Wisconsin Electric Light Company, and within the end of the year, they had suddenly turned a profit. That's another story, but this is essentially the same company. It's going to go through some changes over the years, and it's basically what is Wisconsin Public Service today. Now, the experience of running the river, both for hydroelectric power, for electricity, and for the paper companies, leads to some problems, mainly that the flowing of the river wasn't consistent. And so they were like, the government needs to step in and you know, do something about this. But the government was kind of hesitant to do that. And so they decided to get involved in kind of coming up with a company that would, which is Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company, to basically manage the river, to make sure that everybody had equal access to the flowing and all of that. So that's another area there too. Not quite manufacturing, but kind of in the same vein. In 1911, Wisconsin passes workers' compensation insurance as a thing. It becomes a thing. It's the first of its kind in the nation. And the Wausau Group go, hey, that seems like a good venture, so they create Employers Mutual to do that. They issue the very first policy under this law, which is issued to Mosinee Paper. So there's that, there's a connection. At the time, it was the Wausau Sulfite Fiber Company. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, but there's a lot of little different companies there. But this actually wasn't their first sojourn into insurance, because a couple years earlier, they had gotten involved in the creation of the Great Northern Life Insurance Company. And then finally, you know, in addition to the paper and the utilities and the insurance, you have Marathon Electric and manufacturing. These are sort of the understood to be the main things that the Wausau Group did. I'm going to remove all the ones that Neal Brown wasn't directly involved in. That's it. All of these, he was on the board. He, like the electric company, he was the main driving force behind it. He is the guy that, like I said, Alexander Stewart is the guy that starts this whole motion and makes it, you know, gets everybody together and invests in these companies, but it's Neal Brown who makes them successful. That seems to be the understanding. So not only did he bring his expertise, his law ability, his connections in politics, he also brings his understanding of people. And so he is often credited for bringing up D.C. Everest to Marathon Paper, Hans Hagee to Employers Mutual, Carl Matthey getting him involved in Mosinee Paper. The list goes on. So he kind of makes this stuff happen. And this kind of contributes to the understanding of Neal Brown. I think if you read the historiography, the way that historians have written about him and in his place in the community, there's this sort of elevation. He's put on a pedestal as one of these Wausau Group guys who had the vision to make Wausau what it became today. And I think that's great in some ways, because it means that we have this story that continues. People know who he is. You know, we know that Brown Street is named after Brown and not just the color, right? Actually, I don't know if most people know that Brown Street is named after Neal Brown. But there's also another element. I think Neal Brown himself, there's a really interesting, and again, this is one of these things I could go off for another half an hour on, so I'll contain myself here. But in 1903, he was asked, one of the things that he was very popular is getting him to come down and give a talk, a keynote at a convention or something like that. And in 1903, he goes down to Chicago for the Illinois State Bar Association, and he gives a little talk that he calls The Comedy of History. It's not supposed to be humorous. This is comedy in like the Divine Comedy, you know, that sort of thing. It's like a stark reality. This is what it is. And he is not happy with historians. Without getting too deep into it, basically historians at the time were really interested in this concept of objectivity. We don't want to tell a story that's not true just based off of what we want it to be, so we're just going to use the sources as they are, bare bones history. Today, we look back on that and go, that's crazy. You can't actually be objective. You can try, it's a good goal, but the reality is that, like, even if you just use the sources, well, if you only use, like, censuses and tax records and voting records, well, women probably aren't going to be very well represented on that, are they? Because they don't vote and they generally don't own property. So we look back on this and go, like, that's a great idea, but the sources don't necessarily let us do that. Neal Brown doesn't say that that's bad for that reason. The reason he doesn't like it is because it's boring. And it is. Bare bones history tends to, like, you take this climatic battle of, like, the Roman Republic or, becoming the empire, and you go, like, well, how many people died in it? How much did each side have? And, what, it's just like, well, that can be very interesting and it's good history, but it doesn't tell us what people thought at the time. What does it mean to be a Roman before and after the creation of the empire? The Civil War is an amazing moment in human history. What is it like to be alive during that time? It's great to know about the succession of emperors and politicians and things and generals, but, like, it's boring. And the problem with this, in his mind, is that it leaves the door open for other people to fill that void. If historians aren't doing their best job to tell the history as it was in a way that is engaging and that feels human, that's going to leave the door open for biographers, newspapermen, political people who put people on a pedestal and say, oh, look at this person's history. Aren't they amazing? But actually, we don't like him, so don't use, they don't care about telling the right history. They just want to tell a history that suits their needs. And again, Neal Brown is a little cynical at this point, given his political direction. But I think his point is that, like, don't just put people up on pedestals. Like, Abraham Lincoln is a great man of history. But that's not just because we all agree he's a great man. It's because when you look at his history, you can see the difficulty he went through and how he responded to the tumultuous times he was involved in. So don't just say that, oh, well, this guy was president of this company. That must mean he's a good businessman. Well, not necessarily, right? Neal Brown would say just because somebody's elected to office doesn't mean that they're a good person or capable of doing it. Sometimes other things can happen. And so he doesn't like people being put on pedestals just for the sake of that. And so reading that, I was like, I got to make sure that I don't just tell the myth, but also, who is Neal Brown the man? And it turns out there's a lot of really interesting things. Like I said, he loved to go fishing. He was a menace on the road with his automobiles. He had a temper. He had thoughts about some things politically that he didn't talk about, and some that he probably talked too much about, like the tariff. There's a lot of interesting things about Neal Brown, not just because he was an interesting person, but because he is an interesting lens through which we can see the world around him, which is why, I tried to bring some color, some meat on those bones to give us an understanding of who he was and his place in history. And I think that's where I'm going to call it. So, thanks for coming out this afternoon. I hope that you learned a little bit about Neal Brown and the community here. I guess we can have a chance for question and answers. If people have some questions, I can try to give some answers. Yeah.
Can you tell us about the plaque that's outside the door for workman's comp?
Oh, sure, yeah. So, thank you. So the question was about the plaque. If you came in the side door from a parking lot, not the front of the house, it's easy to miss it if you don't see it, but there's actually a plaque, a Wisconsin history plaque there. And that's not the original place for it. It ended up getting moved and we took it. But it is a plaque commemorating that. So the workers' compensation insurance I mentioned was the first in this country. Technically, New York had a version of workers' compensation that was passed earlier, but it was struck down in the courts. So Wisconsin becomes the first to have one that is still on the books, and it is, in fact, Employers Mutual, or Wausau Insurance, as we have more recently known, that issues that policy. So the policy given by Employers Mutual to the Mosinee Paper Company is the very first workers' compensation plan in the history of the United States. So. And that is up there. So if you're headed out, take a look at that. It's up on the brick wall as you go outside. Yeah.
So is Neal Brown buried in Pine Grove Cemetery or somewhere else?
Yeah, so question was whether Neal was buried in Pine Grove. Absolutely he is, yeah. He has a fairly prominent, if you go down that first column on the very north side, like from where the arch is, and just going up, he's very prominently up at the end of one of those rows, which is fitting, considering that he put so much into Pine Grove and literally gave it its name through his love of the pine tree. So, yeah.
Neal being used in outdoorsman and everything, but also involved in using the river for commercial reasons. Did he have any kind of environmental? Was he kind of a steward of the environment?
Yeah.
Or just use it?
So the question was whether, given Neal's outdoor interests, whether he was, the environment and things like that. There's an interesting thing about Neal Brown, which is he's often very paradoxical. In some ways, like he's super critical of everybody. He wants people to be better, but he's also an endless optimist in the human condition. He loves people and he loves things. When it comes to the environment, it's like, well, he contributed to the cutting of probably billions of trees, but also he deeply loves the environment. The conservation movement is kind of in its infancy at this point, but Neal is very, I think initially he's a little hesitant about that. His political beliefs, but he was very sympathetic to it, yes. And he ends up getting involved in some of the later in life he comes to it, I guess is the way to say it. I don't think he would have felt very, he didn't like Teddy Roosevelt's approach, but he thought the idea was good, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Yeah.
Talked about Pine Grove, but there was a cemetery before that.
Oh, sure, I can
Where
speak to
was
that.
located? I've never
Yeah.
heard anything about it.
Yeah, so the early history of Wausau, Pine Grove is now kind of towards the edge of Wausau. Originally, the cemetery that they ended up was kind of near Hammond Park, where the fire and police station are. It was kind of right there. It was kind of on the hill overlooking the water, and unfortunately, they found out the hard way that with a good storm, some of that will wash away. And so they decided after, I believe there were a few bodies that disappeared down the river, and so they went, okay, let's recover these and then exhume all those bodies, and then that's kind of when the main cemetery becomes Pine Grove.
Town Line Road is north of the Pine Grove Cemetery, so the cemetery was actually outside the city.
Yep. Yeah, well, that is another area. Like in the 1870s and 80s, there's that kind of southern creep that comes down from Wausau, and it takes a little bit for them to, like there used to be a pond down there that was apparently so, like the mosquitoes and everything Marchetti calls it a miasma that would wash over the southern Wausau area, and there was a noticeable lower birth rate, child mortality rates down in that neighborhood. So it takes a lot of work to kind of make that less habitable, more habitable. And as that happens, we start to move down, and then what is the city limits obviously is pushed further. Yeah. All right. Well, it seems like that's it. Thank you for coming out this afternoon.